There are moments in the fog of war when the difference between victory and a missed opportunity can be measured in days, sometimes in hours. Right now, the United States military is operating at the razor's edge of one of the most consequential foreign policy confrontations in a generation. American forces are continuing to carry out precision strikes across Iran. New footage released by United States Central Command is showing the world the extraordinary operational tempo and targeting precision that American forces have maintained throughout this campaign. And yet, at this very same moment, President Donald Trump has made a deliberate and calculated decision to pause, to extend a diplomatic window, to give Iran one more opportunity to step back from the brink, and to allow the machinery of negotiation to work alongside the machinery of war. The pause, however, is not a ceasefire, it is not a retreat, and it is emphatically not a signal of American weakness. What President Trump has done is extend the deadline for striking Iranian energy infrastructure, specifically Iran's power plants, to the 6th of April. That gives Tehran 10 additional days to allow ships to move freely through the Strait of Hormuz, to demonstrate meaningful movement toward a negotiated resolution, and to reckon honestly with what continued resistance will cost. The president has now extended this deadline twice. Each time he has cited what he describes as good faith outreach from Iran, including the passage of 10 ships through the strait, as a gesture of de-escalation. But Iran's own surviving leaders tell a very different story. And behind the diplomatic maneuvering on both sides, the hard questions about strategic objectives, about Russian interference, about 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium, and about whether 10,000 American troops may soon be heading to the region are becoming more urgent by the hour. This is a story about the endgame of a war that has not yet ended, a diplomatic process that both sides describe in contradictory terms, and a set of strategic stakes that extend from the Persian Gulf to Moscow, from the oil markets to the nuclear non-proliferation framework that has governed global security for decades. Tonight we break it all down. The headline facts of this developing situation are these. President Donald Trump has officially announced via his Truth Social platform that he is pausing what he described as the period of energy plant destruction until April 6th. In his own words, the president stated that talks are ongoing. This represents the second time Trump has extended the deadline, each extension granting Iran an additional 10 days to comply with American demands regarding freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The president has described Iran as, in his words, begging to make a deal, and suggested that anyone who has seen what has been happening in the region would understand exactly why Tehran is seeking an exit from this confrontation. Iran's position, as articulated by its surviving leadership and its foreign minister, is diametrically opposed to Trump's characterization. Iranian officials have publicly stated that they have never reached out to initiate talks. Iran's foreign minister went further, describing American military action as unjustified and brutal, asserting that the conflict began on February 28th and claiming that Iran has been engaged in a diplomatic process aimed at resolving American concerns over its nuclear program. The contradiction between these two narratives, one side saying Iran is begging for a deal, the other side saying no outreach was ever made, illustrates the extraordinary difficulty of reading the true state of negotiations when so much of the diplomacy is happening behind closed doors, through back channels, and under conditions of active military conflict. Meanwhile, on a separate but related front, Israeli defense forces operating in southern Lebanon have disclosed the discovery of a tunnel network constructed beneath a Christian church. The IDF's characterization of this find is stark and legally significant. The use of religious sites, including Christian churches, for military purposes is a clear violation of international law. Israeli officials stated that Hezbollah has been exploiting the Christian population of southern Lebanon, turning their places of worship into operational military infrastructure. This disclosure, coming in the midst of the broader regional confrontation involving Iran, serves as a reminder that the conflict extends well beyond the direct military exchange between the United States and Tehran. To fully understand the weight of the decisions now being made in Washington and Tehran, it is essential to understand how this confrontation began, what it was designed to achieve, and why simply declaring victory and withdrawing, as at least one prominent Republican senator has suggested, is a far more complicated proposition than it might appear. The United States did not initiate military action against Iran over a single grievance. As former CIA Chief of Station Dan Hoffman has articulated clearly, the military campaign was launched because the United States lacked a satisfactory deal addressing three distinct and deeply serious challenges. The first was Iran's ballistic missile program, a long-range strike capability that Tehran has spent decades developing and that gives it the ability to threaten targets across the Middle East, into Europe, and as far away as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The second was Iran's nuclear program, specifically its accumulation of highly enriched uranium and centrifuge capacity that has brought it to the very threshold of nuclear weapons capability. The third was Iran's decades-long support for proxy terrorist organizations throughout the region, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Shia militias in Iraq, Hamas in Gaza, on the Houthis in Yemen, a network of armed proxies that has been used to project Iranian power while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. To these three original objectives, a fourth was added when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile wide waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes. Iran's decision to use the strait as a weapon threatening the global energy supply and the economic interests of dozens of nations transformed what was already a serious confrontation into a crisis with genuinely global dimensions. The historical pattern of American confrontations with Iran stretches back more than 4 decades, providing essential context for understanding the current moment. Following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the United States and Iran entered into a state of sustained mutual hostility that has expressed itself in various forms. The hostage crisis, proxy conflicts, economic sanctions, covert operations, and occasional near-direct military confrontations. The 1988 Operation Praying Mantis, in which the United States Navy destroyed a significant portion of Iran's naval forces in a single day of combat, demonstrated America's overwhelming conventional military superiority, but did not resolve the fundamental tension between the two nations. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated under President Obama, represented the most serious attempt at diplomatic resolution of the nuclear question, but it was always limited in scope, addressing the nuclear program while leaving untouched Iran's ballistic missiles, its proxy network, and its regional ambitions. President Trump's withdrawal from that agreement in 2018 and the reimposition of maximum pressure sanctions accelerated the deterioration of the relationship and set the conditions for the current military confrontation. What makes the current moment genuinely different from all previous episodes in the American-Iranian confrontation is the scale and comprehensiveness of the military campaign. CENTCOM has reported extraordinary results in degrading Iran's core military capabilities. The ballistic missile program has been significantly damaged. The drone threat, Iran's most potent asymmetric tool for threatening American bases and regional partners, has been substantially reduced. Air superiority over the Strait of Hormuz has been established, with A-10 Warthog aircraft, Apache H-64 helicopters, and other assets reported to have free rein over the airspace. These are not marginal improvements in the strategic balance. They represent a fundamental shift in the military equation in the Persian Gulf. General Jack Keane, one of the most respected military analysts in the country and a former Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, offered a characteristically direct assessment of where things stand. Iran, General Keane observed, is trying to personally survive and keep the regime somewhat intact. He described Iran as being on the 20-yard line trying to reach the goal line, with the opposition, meaning American and allied forces, placing impediments at every turn. In General Keane's assessment, the United States can see how close it is to attaining its strategic objectives. The implication of his analysis is clear: this is not the moment to stop. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, however, has emerged as what has been described as a rare voice in the Republican Party, arguing for a different course. This week, Kennedy stated publicly that he is concerned and believes it is time to get out. Kennedy acknowledged that some would argue that the Iranian leadership is still standing and could rebuild. But he countered that the United States has already inflicted massive damage on the Iranian government and that the time has come to declare the mission sufficiently accomplished and withdraw. Kennedy's position is a minority view within his party, but it represents a real debate that is beginning to surface in Washington about the scope, duration, and end state of the military campaign. Dan Hoffman's analysis of the Kennedy position is measured but pointed. Hoffman acknowledged that Kennedy is correct, that massive damage has been inflicted on Iran, but Hoffman argued firmly that the United States began this military action with specific strategic objectives on ballistic missiles, the nuclear program, proxy support, and now the Strait, and that those objectives have not yet been fully met. Walking away without achieving them would leave the core challenges unaddressed and potentially allow Iran to reconstitute its capabilities over time. Hoffman's view, shared by General Keane, is that the United States needs to finish the job. The complexity of this picture is dramatically compounded by one factor that has received less public attention than it deserves: the role of Russia. Hoffman made a point of highlighting what he described as a deeply concerning pattern. Russia is actively providing Iran with both strategic intelligence and drone technology. This is not an accident or an oversight. It is a deliberate Russian strategic choice. Moscow views the American campaign against Iran as an extension of the broader geopolitical competition between Russia and the West. Russia has characterized its war against Ukraine as a proxy war against Europe, NATO, and the United States. Iran is Russia's ally in this broader confrontation. By supplying Tehran with drones and intelligence, just as Russia supplied similar assistance to the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, Moscow is seeking to prolong the conflict, inflict costs on the United States and its allies, and maximize turmoil in global oil and gas markets. The involvement of Russia as an active supporter of Iran transforms this from a bilateral American-Iranian confrontation into something considerably more complex and consequential. Iran's strategy in this context, as analysts have noted, is to inflict as much pain on global oil and gas markets as possible and cause maximum economic turmoil while pursuing the survival of the regime. For Tehran, regime survival is itself a form of victory. If the Islamic Republic survives this military campaign without having to permanently surrender its nuclear ambitions or dismantle its ballistic missile program, Iranian leaders will declare victory regardless of the physical damage sustained. This is the fundamental strategic tension at the heart of the current pause. The question of whether the diplomatic window President Trump has opened will produce genuine Iranian concessions on the core issues, or whether it will simply provide Tehran with breathing room to reconstitute, disperse, and prepare for whatever comes next. The question of Iran's remaining enriched uranium is particularly urgent in this context. Hoffman placed the figure at 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium that American forces need to find and secure. This material, buried underground following the strikes of June 2025, represents a potential path back to nuclear weapons capability if Iran is allowed to reconstitute its program. The clock is running on this problem. Every day that passes without a resolution of the uranium question is a day that Iran potentially uses to move, hide, or otherwise protect that material from either extraction or destruction. The diplomatic dimension of this confrontation involves a level of behind-the-scenes activity that is difficult to observe from the outside, but is clearly operating at an intense pace. Hoffman noted that the Central Intelligence Agency is actively collecting intelligence on the Iranian regime specifically to identify whether there are officials within Tehran who might be willing to save what is left of their country by striking a deal, officials who could potentially be brought into a negotiated settlement that would include sanctions relief and a path to economic recovery. This kind of internal regime assessment is exactly the kind of intelligence work that the CIA specializes in, and its active pursuit suggests that the administration is simultaneously preparing for both a diplomatic resolution and a more intensive military phase. The unconfirmed reports that the United States is considering sending as many as 10,000 troops into the region represent perhaps the most significant military escalation signal yet. If accurate, a deployment of that scale would represent a fundamental change in the character of the American military campaign, moving from a predominantly air-based operation to one with significant ground force capability. A ground force of 10,000 troops would provide options that air power alone cannot deliver: the ability to physically secure nuclear material, to occupy and hold strategic terrain, to conduct the kind of sensitive site exploitation that securing Iran's enriched uranium would require. Whether that deployment actually occurs will depend on what happens in the 10 days between now and April 6th. The broader international context of this confrontation continues to evolve rapidly. America's Gulf Cooperation Council partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, have enormous stakes in the outcome and are watching the diplomatic maneuvering with intense interest. These nations depend on free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz for their economic survival. They have been quietly supportive of American military objectives, and they will be deeply reluctant to accept any resolution that leaves Iran with the ability to threaten the strait in the future. Their preferences are a significant factor in the calculus of any endgame. Israel, for its part, continues to conduct its own military operations in Lebanon, as evidenced by the tunnel discovery beneath the Christian church. The IDF's ongoing operations against Hezbollah's infrastructure in southern Lebanon are directly connected to the broader confrontation with Iran. Hezbollah is Tehran's most powerful and capable proxy, and degrading its military infrastructure reduces Iran's ability to open a second front against Israel or American interests in the Levant. The energy markets are watching all of this with acute concern. Iran's deliberate effort to drive turmoil in oil and gas markets is having real effects on energy prices and the broader global economy. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains under threat, every barrel of oil that fails to reach its destination on schedule, every tanker captain who must calculate the risk of transiting the Persian Gulf, all of these ripple effects accumulate into a significant drag on global economic activity. As the April 6th deadline approaches, several key questions will determine the direction of events. Will Iran's leadership make the strategic calculation that genuine concessions on the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and the Strait of Hormuz are necessary for the regime's survival? Or will Tehran, with Russian support, attempt to outlast the American pressure, disperse its remaining capabilities, and preserve the core elements of its strategic program? Will the CIA's behind-the-scenes assessment identify interlocutors within the Iranian regime who can be engaged in serious negotiations? And if diplomacy fails, will the administration authorize a ground force deployment that would fundamentally change the character of the conflict? The decision to pause strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure while maintaining the broader military campaign is a delicate balance that reflects the complexity of the situation. As Hoffman noted, the pause applies specifically to energy infrastructure. It does not pause the ongoing assault on Iran's military-industrial base. American forces retain air superiority over the strait. The pressure continues. The pause is a diplomatic tool, not a military concession. What this extraordinary moment in the American-Iranian confrontation ultimately reveals is the profound difficulty of translating military superiority into durable political outcomes. The United States has inflicted massive damage on Iran's military capabilities. General Keane is right that the finish line is in sight. But finishing the job, achieving the full range of strategic objectives that justified the military campaign in the first place, requires either Iranian capitulation through diplomacy or a level of military action that will carry its own significant costs and risks. Senator Kennedy's instinct to declare victory and leave is understandable. The desire to conclude military operations, bring troops home, and avoid further escalation is a legitimate political and human impulse. But as Dan Hoffman and General Keane have argued, walking away from this confrontation without securing the core objectives on nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, proxy support, and freedom of navigation would leave those problems unresolved and potentially allow Iran to emerge from this conflict in a position to reconstitute its capabilities and challenge American and allied interests again in the future. 10 days. That is the window President Trump has provided. 10 days for Iran to make the choices that could end this confrontation on terms that address the core challenges that brought America into this fight. 10 days for diplomacy to do what it has never quite managed to do in more than 4 decades of American-Iranian hostility. 10 days, and then the next decision point arrives. And on April 6th, the world will be watching.